In 1954, Jonas Salk came up with a vaccine for polio, and it needed to be tested. And this happened, and we ended up with one of the most famous clinical trials ever done in history, one of the most amazing clinical trials ever done in history. So let me give you some background. In the 20th century, around in the 1950s, a big polio epidemic hit the U.S. It struck the hardest at children, and it was responsible for 6% of deaths among 5 to 9-year-olds, plus a lot of permanent paralysis. Polio can affect the brain and the spinal cord, can cause paralysis or even death. Sometimes it results in just small effects like muscle weakness, but other times it can permanently cripple a person. If it paralyzes the lungs, a person can't breathe, and there were these machines that were in the 1950s and 60s that are called an iron lung, and it basically used pressure inside this chamber to force people's lungs open and close so that they could breathe. So this was a horrible death. Pictures like this were really common, and people were terrified of the disease. So you can see here that polio was a disease that affected people all along, but for some reason from 1950 to about 1954, the disease there was an epidemic, and it may have had something to do with World War II and increasing mobility, people being sent overseas and then coming back, that maybe the disease spread as a result of that. I'm not sure what caused it, but at any rate, there was enormous fear and desperation in the country because this disease especially was, small children were especially susceptible to this disease. So Jonas Salk had developed a vaccine, and it looked really promising, but it couldn't be distributed without further testing. We had an issue, though, that the polio rate, even though there was a large epidemic of it, it was still only affected about 50 out of every 100,000 people. So let's say you had a trial, an experiment, and you assigned 10,000 people to get the vaccine and 10,000 people to be the control group. Well, you would only expect about 5 out of the 100,000 or of the 10,000 to get polio in the first place, and if the vaccine was about 50% effective, only 2 to 3 in the treatment group. And those results are too small to really know if they're statistically significant. That could have just happened by random chance. So clinical trials were needed on a massive scale, and in the end, 1.6 million children were involved in the experiment. So one of the problems with the vaccine trial was the ethical considerations. The experiment required a control group. Well, why? If we go back and look at the graph here, it required a control group because the rate of polio varied from year to year. So if a bunch of people got the vaccine and the rate went down, we wouldn't know necessarily if it was the vaccine that caused the rate to go down or if the rate was just going down for everybody in the country anyway. So we definitely needed a control group to compare. So let me get back where I was. So we needed a control group. That means that some children would get the vaccine and some would not. How do you decide who gets which one? Can you randomly assign children to treatments? Okay, so there's a lot of things to think about. Is it ethical to give only some children the vaccine? That leaves the other ones exposed to polio. Imagine yourself as a parent in these desperate times. Would you allow your children to participate in getting a drug that hadn't been fully tested yet, was still somewhat experimental? Ultimately, does the benefit to society outweigh the risk to those children who would not get the vaccine, or even the risk to the children who do get the vaccine and might experience some unknown side effects? Okay, so I think these days, I'm not sure that this experiment could be done. I think parents would be very reluctant to do that unless there was a similar desperate epidemic situation. And that's really why this happened. It was because parents were desperate. So there are 2 different experiments that ran simultaneously with this. The one was this design. First, second, and third graders were used in the experiment. They offered the vaccination to second graders, but was only given to those whose parents consented. So there were some second graders who consented, got the vaccine, others who did not consent. Then the first and third graders were used as a control group. They did not get a shot at all. So what sort of problems were there with this design? Maybe you're thinking of some already. One of them was that they were in separate grades. Maybe there was a difference between the rate of polio in among the second graders and versus the first and third graders, because polio is a very contagious disease. It can spread very easily just by sneezing or touch. You know, you sneeze on your hand and touch someone else. It's very contagious. So maybe the fact that first and third and second graders were separated in different classrooms, maybe the disease would spread differently within different classrooms. So that was a problem, possible confounding variable. Also, the placebo effect. Some children got shots and some didn't. It's possible that the children who got shots might have a psychological benefit to having gotten a treatment and actually help their body fight off the disease better. Also, we had a problem with the evaluators not being blinded. It would be easy to ask a child, did you get the shot or didn't you? And the evaluators, the doctors who are checking for polio symptoms, would know which child got the shot and which didn't. And in a case where the symptoms weren't obvious, where it was kind of hard to tell, it might create some sort of bias towards or away from thinking, well, they got the shot, it kind of looks like polio, but it's probably just a cold. Or it might be a cold, but it's probably polio because they didn't get the shot. So it might influence them one way or the other. However, there was something even more major that nobody was even aware of. There was no randomization involved in this experiment. Only the shots were only given to those who consented. Because there was no randomization, we ended up with this unexpected confounding variable. And here's what it was. Wealthier and more educated parents were more likely to consent to the vaccine, probably because wealthier and more educated parents were more likely to have a personal acquaintance with doctors and nurses and trust them more. They were maybe more likely to trust the government more because they had a good relationship with the government, being wealthier and more educated. Less wealthy, less educated people might be less trustful of those in authority, so they would be less likely to consent. But here's the funny thing, very unexpected. Children from the higher income families were actually more vulnerable to polio. Well, why is that? Poorer children in less hygienic surroundings actually were exposed to the polio virus very early in their life because they didn't live in hygienic situations. And when they were very young, they still had antibodies protected from their mother. And so they developed an immunity to the disease from a very young age, whereas higher income people kept their children in very clean surroundings. They weren't exposed to the disease, so when they did get exposed, they were more likely to get it. They hadn't developed any natural immunity to it. Moral of the story is, let your kids play in the dirt, people. It's really good for them. Seriously. So if the polio rate did not decrease for the people who got vaccinations, we would have two possible options. Was maybe the vaccine was ineffective, or maybe it was just the treatment group were more likely to get polio anyway because of the socioeconomic differences. So that caused some problems in interpreting the results of the experiment. Recognizing that these things were a problem, another group did the experiment a completely different way. They relied only on the volunteer subjects. Obviously, you can't randomly force parents to give their children a vaccine. Okay, that's not ethical. So they first took volunteers. Who wants to be in the experiment? Then, among those volunteers, half of them were randomly assigned to the treatment, and half of them were assigned to control groups. It was a double-blind design. Everybody got a shot. The control group was given a placebo shot, just salt water. The placebo and the vaccine looked exactly alike. So people who were giving the shot got little vials that were labeled exactly the same except for a code, and they didn't know what the code meant, so they didn't know which shot they were giving. The doctors looking for symptoms of polio were blinded because they didn't know which shot the children got, so they were less, they were not biased in their way they evaluated the symptoms at the end. Jonas Salk himself called it a beautiful experiment over which the epidemiologists would become quite ecstatic, but which would make the humanitarian shudder. The epidemiologist is a statistician that deals with clinical trials like this. They would think, wow, this is the way to do it. This is going to give me great results. But the humanitarian says, okay, here are these parents signing up for what they hope will protect their child from polio, but only half of them are getting a real shot, and they don't even know which one is getting which. That's a really strong ethical problem. However, parents were desperate enough to do it anyway. Interestingly, one of the a statistician who, a statistics teacher who taught AP statistics for many years and has also taught statistics at the college level, is the author of one of the textbooks used for AP statistics, a book that I used for 10 years. He was actually one of the children in this experiment. He got a placebo shot, and he remembered as a second grader being really ticked off that he had to get a second shot when the vaccine was actually given because the first one was a fake. Okay, so here are the results. The second design, the randomized controlled experiment, the better design, they had 200,000 in the treatment group, 200,000 in the control group. So out of the 400,000 that volunteered, they were randomly assigned to one of the two treatments. The polio rate per 100,000 was 28. The control group had a polio rate of 71 per 100,000, which is a pretty decent difference, although we'll have to find out if it's statistically significant, because that's still a small number out of 100,000. Notice the group that did not give consent had a lower polio rate than the control group, and that's because these are the ones, remember, that are probably less educated, and they are more likely to be already immune. So it showed that was a very interesting result. And that result actually didn't show up until after the experiment. They realized that that had happened. Then in the, and so that's the whole idea, randomization. We randomly assign to treatments because we want to make the groups as alike as possible in the variables that we don't know about, okay? This was an unknown variable. We didn't know that wealthier parents, the children in wealthy families, were more likely to contract polio. They weren't aware of that till after the experiment had been done, but the fact that they randomly assigned from the same group of volunteers took care of that problem. Those children were evenly distributed among the groups, so that effect was not a problem. However, here in design number 1, we did have that issue where the vaccine, those who consented to the vaccine in grade 2, were more likely to contract the polio, and the control group was the group that didn't consent, okay, or they were just the actually they were not the didn't consent people. Here's the group that didn't consent. The control group had a little of everybody in it. Notice we didn't see as distinct of a difference between the polio rate in the control and the treatment group, because these groups were different in the way they were made up. This was primarily all high-income people. This was a mixture. So this group, the grades 1 and 3, reflected the overall rate of polio in the general population. Grade 2 affected the overall rate among wealthy people with a vaccine. So it was kind of harder to tell what the results were on this one. Now let's check. Were the results of the better experiment statistically significant? Both results showed that the vaccine did lower the rate of polio, but let's see how big of a deal this was. So was the polio vaccine effective, or were the differences in polio rates just due to random chance? What are the chances of randomly getting such a large difference, the 28 and the 71 out of 100,000 in the two groups? So let's imagine that we have a polio coin where the chance of heads is equal to the chance that a person gets polio. So this is not a 50-50 coin. This is 50 out of 100,000 or the rest, okay, which would be what? 50 out of 100,000 or 999,950 out of 100,000 would not get polio. So if you flip that coin in room A for 200,000 times, and then you flipped it in room B for 200,000 times, basically saying we're just randomly taking the rate of polio and dividing up among the two groups with no vaccine effectiveness at all, what's the chance that you'd get as large a difference as 28 heads in one and 71 heads in the other group? It's only about 1 in a billion. So that means it's so unlikely to have happened by random chance that the results are statistically significant. The effect is so large that it would rarely occur by chance. Okay, so what's the aftermath? 1 year after the trials were started, they were stopped because it was clear already that the vaccine was working, and they wanted to get children vaccinated as quickly as possible. So in 1955, they started vaccinating children all over the U.S. This was a boon for me because I was born in 1958, so I never had to worry about polio. My parents never had to worry about polio. I was the oldest in my family, so my parents never had to worry about this disease because the polio vaccine had come. So that was a wonderful thing. Polio was virtually eliminated from the Americas in 1994, but still circulated in Asia and Africa, paralyzing many of the world's most vulnerable children. Children who often were weak in their health to start with because they were malnourished and so forth. So in 1988, the Global Polio Eradication Initiative was begun. That year, an estimated 350,000 children were paralyzed with polio worldwide, but they began vaccinating. So how did that change? So look at this number, 350,000 children paralyzed. That doesn't mean that only that many caught polio. That's just the ones that were paralyzed. There are probably many more cases of polio. Now in 2000, the most recent thing I read was in 2013 there were only 407 cases worldwide. 80% of the world's population now live in polio-free zones. The only countries that left that aren't polio-free zones are countries that are still embroiled in wars, and so it's hard to get to the vaccine. It's hard to vaccinate everybody because it's a war zone. But other than that, it's pretty much been eradicated. I know that Bill and Melinda Gates, very wealthy people, Microsoft, billionaire, multi-billionaire guy, has been one of the people that have donated monies through foundations to help increase the rate of vaccinations in poor countries. Other people, I think the United States has donated also for those kinds of things. So as a result of the Salk vaccine field trials, double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized, comparative experiments became the gold standard of statistics. In other words, the way that experiment design number 2 was done was shown to be so effective that became the way you do it. That's the way you do it. There was a massive clinical trials industry where drug testing was done and experiments were done to see if the drugs were effective and so forth. But as a result, then you have a lot of ethical questions involving when you do experiments involving human subjects. So now there are lots of safeguards in place. You have to have a specific informed consent forms that are standard throughout the industry. There has to be an institutional review board that gives oversight to make sure people are well informed and aren't being mistreated. There has to be confidentiality. There has to be ethical considerations, like if you start to notice a treatment is working, then you take people off the experiment and you give them the treatment. You don't just withhold it. And so all kinds of things. There have been ethical violations, and we'll discuss those and read about those in some of the articles we do in class. But for the most part now, it's much, an experiment like that one probably couldn't happen anymore, unless people were desperate enough to do it anyway, to give their informed consent despite the risks. The placebo effect has become a fascinating area of research. Interestingly enough, in a condition such as pain, when you report, like I have this much pain or my pain's on a level from 1 to 10, the percent of patients responding to placebos has shown to be 20 to 50% will say they're better even though they got a placebo. Now, that's not the same as saying a placebo will cure diseases, but it does seem to have an effect on the level of pain that patients feel. And that's an interesting thing in itself. That means that the body can be actually coaxed to heal itself by methods other than drugs. Today, another thing that's different is today few clinical trials use placebos. In the past, there was maybe not a treatment at all for a disease, so you'd have a placebo and a treatment. But now most of the new drugs are improvements over existing drugs, and so it would be unethical to withhold a treatment from a patient. So it's basically comparing a new drug to an old drug rather than a drug to a placebo. So just in closing, this Salk vaccine field trial was a landmark trial. It revolutionized the way medical clinical trials were done. It resulted in enormous benefit for first the United States and then the world as far as protecting children and adults too against a very crippling disease. So it's fascinating, shows a lot of the concepts of the experimental design that we do.